You're listening to the Bloomberg Sound On podcast. Catch us live weekdays at 1 Eastern on Bloomberg.com, the iHeartRadio app, and the Bloomberg Business app. Or listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts.
It's great to have you with us here as Washington gets that day before vacation feel. We'll call this the jet fumes edition of Sound On. Can you smell them? Congress trying to finish the work so everybody can get on a jet and go home tonight for the August recess. It's a magical time when things get done. Incidentally, as we wait for temperatures to reach 100 degrees in the nation's capital, it's time to go, everybody. So let's bring you up to date on where we are, and that's as we understand things at this very moment, set to change before the end of the day. For those playing along in your home games, the House expected to pass the military construction veterans bill today. The agriculture bill that we talked about with Congressman Rose yesterday, it looks like that might go on the shelf. May be delayed until September as they argue over a ban on abortion pill mail delivery. We're back to this again in the Senate, though. Looks like they finish all 12 bills today, the appropriations bills, and then they'll pass, likely, the NDAA tonight. That's the expectation, the big annual defense spending bill. And again, everybody gets on a jet and goes home. The question is, what happens when they all come back? And that's where we start with Brendan Boyle. Glad to say the congressman from Pennsylvania's 2nd District is with us, the great city of Philadelphia. He is the ranking member on the House Budget Committee. And Congressman, I wonder, do you hear the word shutdown in the offices and corridors of the Capitol, or is that for the media to talk about right now?
Well, great to be back with you, Joe, and I apologize if you're hearing a horn behind me. That's signaling here in the House.
It's a big party.
Perfect timing, right as soon as.
Does that mean you have to run to vote right now?
It looks like I have about 10 minutes.
Okay.
So, and I'm still in okay shape, so I can make it from my office to the
I know
Capitol,
you can.
maybe a little less than that. But before I not a jet, but get on Amtrak to go home to Philadelphia, there's still important work that will be done here today. But in terms of avoiding a shutdown midnight September 30th, I have to say my concern level is increasing. You referenced earlier the chaos caucus. It continues. The divisions internally within the House Republican caucus continue to prevent things from getting done here in the House of Representatives. We struck, I think, a very fair agreement between the White House, congressional Republicans, congressional Democrats, to avoid what would have been a catastrophic default. That bill passed last month. 2/3 of House Republicans voted for it, 80% of House Democrats. And yet now Kevin McCarthy is backing away from that because he's being held up by the Chaos Caucus.
Well, it was an interesting conversation to hear a couple of days ago, Congressman, when members of the Freedom Caucus held a news briefing to talk about this. Listen to the way Representative Bob Good put it for those who were listening. Here he is.
We should not fear a government shutdown. Most of what we do up here is bad anyway. Most of what we do up here hurts the American people. When we do stuff to the American people while promising to do things for the American people, essential operations continue. 85%, as Mr. Biggs has just given me that number, continues. Most of the American people won't even miss if the government is shut down temporarily.
All right, so Congressman, there's a lot there. Beginning with most of what we do up here is bad anyway. There does seem to be a feel in that part of the House that is the case, and so therefore, why not break it? How do you negotiate with that?
Well, that's crazy in a word. That is really representing the viewpoint of the most extreme 5%. The problem is it is that extreme 5% that right now is in charge of the House Republican caucus and that Speaker McCarthy just refuses to stand up to. I am increasingly concerned they will drive us toward a government shutdown. And the reality is, as we lived through in 1994, 95, 96, if you recall, as well as a number of times in the last decade, every government shutdown actually costs taxpayers money. It costs the economy. There is a real cost to these government shutdowns. Of course, most Americans recognize that. Economists of all stripes, conservative and liberal, recognize that. It's only an extreme element that thinks there's no problem with the government shutdown. The problem is it's that extreme minority right now that is in charge when it comes to House Republicans.
I know they say that Democrats are the ones standing in the way because of what they call woke policies at the Pentagon and in other agencies, and it does make you start to worry if nobody can see eye to eye on this, how you make progress. But can you tell us what happens before the end of the day or the week, Congressman? It looks like the Milcon bill will pass. What happens to that agriculture FDA bill?
Well, first, I get a little sick and tired of the extreme right, Ted Cruz and some others, continually running down the military of the United States of America. We have the strongest military in the history of the world. And increasingly, we see Republicans, Ron DeSantis is another, continually bashing our own military. It's just completely bizarre to me. But second, in terms of the individual appropriations, I don't think, based on the latest here, just a little after or 1 o'clock Thursday afternoon, it does not appear as if the Republican side has the votes to push forward with an appropriation to get it passed before we leave in September. Again, I come back to this. We had a deal, an agreement that passed the House, passed the Senate, was signed by the president. I voted for it. It wasn't one that I loved, but it was fair. It was a good agreement, which is why 80% of House Democrats and two-thirds of House Republicans voted for it. But it is that most extreme so-called Freedom Caucus element that right now is leading Kevin McCarthy by the nose. Well,
this is really, we're seeing the re-litigation of the debt limit deal, right? I mean, It's almost like it never happened, Congressman. You must wake up and wonder what world you're in some days.
Yeah, it's the folks who were on the extreme right who were very angry that bill passed, and it passed by such a big bipartisan majority. If you remember, they took out their anger the very next week by continually voting down what's called the rule. It's a procedural thing that actually prevented any bills from being voted on that whole following week. And again, out of 435 members, we're only talking about 20. But the problem is, since Speaker McCarthy doesn't want to engage with Democrats and achieve things on a bipartisan basis, he's entirely reliant on Republican votes. So it just gives tremendous leverage to those 20 most extreme members.
Well, it's interesting because the members of the Freedom Caucus, like Chip Roy, who were clearly very upset at the results, the final product of that quote-unquote deal, were upset with the speaker and seemed to think that he, betrayed them in this deal-making somehow. Do you feel like the speaker is now betraying you by not living up to it?
Well, I mean, he's clearly not living up to the agreement that was reached and that was passed again by the House, the Senate, and signed into law by the president. It's hard to see what exactly the strategy is there from Speaker McCarthy, and I do fear that we will be forced into a government shutdown come September 30th that the overwhelming majority in Congress do not want.
Is it likely to coincide with the end of the year like that? I know there's also a lot of talk about a CR, a continuing resolution that might bring us closer to the end of the year. But then the great fear is, of course, if we still acknowledge that debt ceiling deal, that would invoke an across-the-board 1% cut. So the thought was that was a big inflection point at the end of the year. Either we clear that hurdle or the government shuts down.
And to be clear, that kind of trigger mechanism would take place not September 30th, but if there wasn't an agreement in place by December 30th. So I would certainly argue for a clean CR if we get to September 30th and there is no budget agreement. Government shutdowns always have a cost. They achieve absolutely nothing. They are stupid. And the party that, if you go back the last 30 years, the party that is seen as responsible for forcing a government shutdown almost always is punished in the very next election.
Boy, it's amazing how we relive history in some of these cases. When you look around and consider the deals that were made between the Speaker and the Freedom Caucus, largely when he was becoming Speaker, I know that not everyone knows what actually was agreed to here. Are you concerned that will eat into the negotiations in your own budget committee when it comes time to finish this job after the August recess?
Well, I mean, as you know, we still don't have even a budget proposal from the House Republican majority. This has been a continuing theme ever since that very first day on January 3rd, and that is you have a badly internally divided House Republican caucus. They are governed by the Chaos Caucus, and that prevents a lot of good things from happening where we do have large bipartisan consensus.
Got to ask you about the chances of an indictment for Donald Trump today. He just posted on Truth Social while you and I were talking, Congressman, that there was no indication of notice during the meeting that his attorneys had with the DOJ this morning. Do not trust the fake news on anything. There was a thought that we might get that news today. Do you think it happens at all?
I mean, I have absolutely no idea, so I rely on whatever the media is reporting in terms of indictment. I just feel exactly the same way I felt 2.5 years ago as I was sitting barricaded in my office, moving furniture to block the doorways so that the insurrectionists wouldn't come in. And that is that Donald Trump is responsible for the insurrection. He's responsible why there wasn't a peaceful transfer of power in this country, and is ultimately responsible for why a number of police officers lost their lives as a result of that day. And I would like to see him finally held responsible.
It's entirely possible, based on what we understand from the reporting around this potential indictment, that if there are charges, that they may be specific to efforts to overturn the results of the 2020 election and not the actions of the president or his supporters on January 6th itself. Would that be a disservice?
It's really hard for me to say in both the abstract and hypothetical. I'm also not an attorney, thank God. I mean, I have one strike against me as a member of Congress, so at least I don't have two. I would really kind of defer judgment until we actually see if and when there is an indictment and what the specific charges are. But just me as, a non-lawyer, there's no doubt in my mind that morally, ethically, in every other practical way, the whole period of those 2 months between the election and the ultimate inauguration, which had to take place, by the way, with 20,000 National Guard troops in the capital of the United States of America, and while we were inside a fenced area with barbed wire. Let's never forget what Donald Trump is responsible for and the disgrace that culminated in January of 2021.
Well, when we get news, obviously we'll share it with our listeners here. And for someone who was on an Amtrak earlier this morning, I hope you have a good ride home, Congressman. Thanks for coming to see us. Brendan Boyle, the congressman from Pennsylvania's 2nd. That's downtown Philadelphia, and the ranking member on the Budget Committee, for a little peek behind the curtain on the way this is all going. And clearly we don't really necessarily know. I'm Joe Mathieu on Bloomberg Radio, and we assemble our panel. Rick Davis is here, Bloomberg politics contributor and Republican strategist, joined today by Lincoln Mitchell, the Democratic analyst, lecturer at the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. Lincoln also writes a Substack on baseball and politics. It's a lot of fun, called Kibitzing with Lincoln. Great to have both of you with us here. Rick, I'll just start with the news at hand. I talked about a lot with the congressman, but as far as this Trump indictment goes, there was an expectation around the country today that we might get some news today. They just emerged as attorneys from a meeting at the Department of Justice. He says it was productive. He says that they explained in detail he did nothing wrong and that an indictment would only further destroy our country. What do you think really happened behind closed doors?
Oh, I have no doubt some of that did happen. I mean, this was their shot on goal to convince the prosecutors that the special counsel that he shouldn't be indicted. And this is pretty routine behavior for a process like this. And it is the last step before an indictment. And so everything we're hearing coming out of that meeting, different from Donald Trump's email, is that the prosecutors told him, we're going to indict your client. And so I think that we probably got no other procedural barriers ahead of us, and we'll be hearing from the special prosecutor soon, I suspect.
All right, we'll have a lot more with Rick and with Lincoln Mitchell. Our panel today will take a deeper dive on this and what's happening and not happening over the next 24 hours on Capitol Hill. It does look like Washington will be a ghost town tomorrow. We'll take a look at the punch list coming up. This is Sound On, only on Bloomberg.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Sound On podcast. Catch the program live weekdays at 1 Eastern on Bloomberg Radio, the TuneIn TuneIn app, Bloomberg.com, and the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
The headline on the terminal: Trump team braces for indictment over January 6th as soon as Thursday. Thursday's today. And then I read the truth. It's only moments old. Has what, 415 likes? Now at, 3,000 likes. My attorneys had a productive meeting with the DOJ this morning, writes the former president, explaining in detail, I did nothing wrong, was advised by many lawyers, and that an indictment of me would only further destroy our country. Here's the news. Well, here's what he says is the news. No indication of notice was given during the meeting. He writes, do not trust the fake news on anything. Let's reassemble the panel. Rick Davis is here, Bloomberg Politics contributor, Republican strategist, joined by Lincoln Mitchell, a Democratic analyst, lecturer at the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. Lincoln, it's great to have you back. What do you think here? As soon as Donald Trump says, no indication of notice, don't trust fake news, does that mean an indictment is about to drop?
Well, thank you for having me back on. I think what happened is his lawyers met with the Justice Department and cleared everything up, and now they're dropping the case. No, I'm joking about that. What strikes me
quite
here,
a headline.
What strikes me here is from that truth, whatever that's called. It's not a tweet, but that truth post that you read, is that Donald Trump has one card to play always, right? And that card is, I'm the victim. Don't believe anything you'd hear from anyone but me. Remember, early in his presidency, a supporter in Congress said, if it's critical of Donald Trump, it's fake news. He has one card to play, but that card is very powerful among his base. And look, an indictment is indictment. There has to be a trial. I am, like the congressman who was on earlier in the show, much to my mother's chagrin, not an attorney, so I'm not going to get into kind of what's going on with the legal case there. But this is the process we have to have. But regardless of where this goes, his base, and that's roughly, the low ball is probably 30% of the American people, are going to believe that he is innocent and he is the victim. And that is potentially very destructive for the fabric of the American polity, as the Trump movement always has been. And what strikes me also is that, Trump's lawyers can say what they want, but the world knows, and certainly in New York, where I live, the world really knows Trump can't get good lawyers because he doesn't pay them. And, a good grown-up lawyer might say, listen, Mr. President, you're in real trouble here. Maybe it's time to think about cutting a deal. Maybe it's time to think about working with this, because this could end up with you behind bars. That is not impossible. I continue to say I wouldn't bet on that, but it's no longer impossible. And that's where I think things stands today. We don't know what's going to happen in the next day, week, etc.
Donald Trump cutting a deal, Rick, in this world?
Well, he is the master of the deal.
I've heard something about that.
You can only assume that that's on the table, but certainly every indication that he's giving and his campaign is giving is that he thinks this is good for his campaign. He's running against the establishment. He's running against the deep state. These are all actors in the deep state and the establishment. And his narrative is strong, which is, they're trying to keep me from power, to keep me from helping all of my supporters, all of you. I'm just a vassal for your interests. And look, that all goes away if he cuts a deal with the deep state. He's now set it up to be very difficult for him to backtrack. Not because it's not a bad idea to do. As Lincoln said, this is kind of right down his alley, but he's making it very difficult based on the ads that are being produced by his super PAC and his own social media activity, that he's just put himself into a very, very tight corner. And this isn't even the last shoe to drop. We're still waiting to hear from the Georgia grand juries that exist. That's a harder deal to cut because, he can't actually pardon himself if he's someday president for state charges. So he's racking up a lot of pain right now. And frankly, doing the one thing that he should never do, which is get in the way of Ron DeSantis, deconstructing his campaign. I mean, DeSantis had the worst week in politics, and Trump is interrupting it.
Well, I'll tell you, we'll see how this goes. We're going to talk a little bit more about Ron DeSantis in a couple of moments. While we're talking about Donald Trump here, and following our conversation with Congressman Brendan Boyle, Lincoln, I wonder, does the dysfunction that we're seeing in Washington spill over onto the campaign trail to benefit one party or the other, or is that just noise and what people already expect?
My inclination is that it's what people have come to expect from Washington, but I don't believe that's all of the truth. There is a perception, I think, among not a consensus, but a perception among probably a slim majority that it is the Republicans who are obstructing here. That is what we've seen in previous times when we've kind of gone up to the edge of the shutdown. And I think Congressman Boyle explained exactly why that happens, but why that has happened in the past and is likely to happen again. But what strikes me about Rick's comments, with which I agree, I mean, I was saying he would cut a deal if he were kind of thinking as a smart strategist, but he's not. He's thinking about, staying in the headlines and winning the primary. Is that what matters to the Republican Party and to Donald Trump right now is not winning general elections. This is not Donald Trump's strategy is win the primary, which he's likely to do, and then be a disruptive force in the general election, and perhaps go back to where we were on January 6th of 2021. Mm-hmm. The Republican Party's legislative strategy is have enough power to block a Democratic president. And because of the Electoral College, it means the race is always going to be closer than it is. It's going to be almost impossible to get a filibuster-proof majority in the Senate, and they control the Supreme Court. So it is clear that what the Republicans are doing in Congress in the long run is not good for their party. What it is good for, if you're a Republican, is fighting off a primary challenger. And that, for most of these Republicans, is more important than governing or even having to win a general election, because most of them don't have general elections.
Well, let's talk about the primary here for a moment. We heard earlier today from Governor Chris Sununu from New Hampshire was talking on CNN about the importance of the New Hampshire primary. And of course, it's up to him to say that. That's, he thinks kings are made there and never heard of a place called Iowa. But it is looking like the first couple of states here are going to be as important as ever. Listen to what he said and we'll have you respond.
And I think you'll see 2 or 3 more by then drop out in the late October, November timeframe because their polls are just sitting in single digits. And right before Iowa, my guess is you're going to see 5 people in the race, something like that.
Okay.
After New Hampshire, you got to get it down to one-on-one.
One-on-one after New Hampshire. Few know New Hampshire politics better than you, Rick Davis. They loved John McCain. Is he right?
Yeah, I mean, there is a culling down of the field usually in Iowa, and I would say since the Iowa caucus, since the Iowa party got rid of the Ames straw poll, which used to happen in the summer before the caucus, we've lost one of those culling events, right? That used to actually wipe out quite a few campaigns. And yet, whether you can have the ambition of a one-on-one with likely Donald Trump after the New Hampshire caucus, I think that might be a little bullish, but it definitely will win the field. It's just a question of how many other candidates are vying for the second slot in order to compete against Donald Trump. But you could have a situation where Donald Trump doesn't win Iowa or New Hampshire and is a pretty wounded candidate going into the next phase of the primaries if he doesn't. If he does get some decent competition between now and then.
Well, Lincoln, is Chris Sununu right about that? Imagine a one-on-one coming out of New Hampshire. By the way, we almost saw that on the Democratic side last time. Remember, it was by the time Joe Biden got to South Carolina, it was a different world. Do you see that happening?
Well, Chris Sununu is right in that that's the kind of thing he has to say to get a job on the national media as a pundit. Okay. He's wrong in the sense of speaking accurately. I'm going to try to say this as clearly as possible. Barring a major health crisis, Donald Trump will be the Republican nominee. And those of us, including Rick and I, who, we are pundits, we like to go on panels, we live this stuff. Yeah. We would like a better story. That is, but we also have an allegiance to tell the truth. And Donald Trump has an overwhelming lead. He is at over 50% in most polls. He is beating the number 2 candidate who was running a terrible campaign and flailing by 2 or 3 to 1. And it is much later in the process that people think. First of all, by, basically August 1st of 2015, Donald Trump had a lead he never gave up. By August 5th in 2019, Joe Biden had a lead. He lost some early primaries, but he had a lead that he basically never gave up. Secondly, August 1st is much later in the process than it used to be because all of this is accelerated. Yep. Donald Trump will be the nominee. We want to tell a story. Smart Republicans, and I would put Chris Sununu in that category, know that it's the wrong thing to nominate Donald Trump. It's going to hurt their party. So they want to think of a path for a Tim Scott, a Nikki Haley, an Asa Hutchinson.
Sure.
But Trump is in such a strong position here. And I would say the same thing on the Democratic side. People are weaving out. I heard Andrew Yang on some bizarre fantasy on a podcast this morning talking about how secretly the Democrats are telling people like Gavin Newsom that Biden won't run and he's the guy. That's nonsense. Biden versus Trump is the election that almost nobody in America wants.
All right.
And barring a major health crisis for either person, that's why we're going to get it again.
And as Lincoln says, the longer this drags out, it's good for business for a lot of us. But we'll give you the straight scoop here.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Sound On podcast. Catch us live weekdays at 1 Eastern on Bloomberg.com, the iHeartRadio app, and the Bloomberg Business app. Or listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts.
Look at the results on the terminal when you search the name DeSantis. Just a basic news search. The top 3 headlines: DeSantis plans major economic speech next week as part of Reset. DeSantis lays off a third of staff in reboot of campaign. And Ron DeSantis uninjured in car accident ahead of campaign event. Sounds like a tough week. As he embraces RFK Jr. in the latest back and forth here. Interesting knowing that RFK Jr., the self-labeled Democrat, is running for the Democratic nomination, but he's become a bit of a trope for Republicans who have fun with this whole thing. He just testified last week before Jim Jordan's committee in the House. And now Ron DeSantis says he thinks he might hire him if he were to become president to run 1 or 2 important agencies. Here's what he said.
But there's a whole host of other things that he'd probably be out of step with. And so on that regard, it's like, okay, if you're president, sick him on the FDA if he'd be willing to serve, or sick him on CDC. But in terms of being VP, if there's, 70% of the issues that he may be averse to our base on, that just creates an issue.
Okay. I asked if he might, be a vice presidential. No, but I'd have him run the CDC, the FDA, sick him, as he said, on the CDC. And it brings me to this note today from Larry Sabato, from Sabato's Crystal Ball at the University of Virginia. And a little something called the wine track versus beer track. A handy construction, he says, coined by political analyst Ron Brownstein. And you can imagine where we're going here. Donald Trump tends to resonate with the beer track, leaving an opening, at least on paper, for Ron DeSantis to capture the wine track. You can imagine this, right? The beer track, non-college, the wine track, college-educated, C-suite, white-collar. You get the point here. But it's not been working out that way. In fact, a series of recent polls shows that Donald Trump is winning the beer and wine track, making many wonder, again, what's the path for Ron DeSantis? Certainly, if you're not going to crack the 30% MAGA base that won't budge, what's the path? We reassembled a panel. Rick Davis, Bloomberg Politics contributor, Republican strategist. Lincoln Mitchell, Democratic analyst, lecturer at the School of International Public Affairs at Columbia University. Rick, I loved reading the political playbook this morning because it was all about you, as apparently the one man in American history who managed to successfully reboot a presidential campaign. And we remember that, as you said, going from first to last to first when you were running John McCain's campaign. I don't know when Ron DeSantis is going to call you, but what would you tell him if he did?
Save your quarter. Look, I mean, it's a very simple construct. You actually have to say things that are relevant to Republican primary voters and people who are voting in caucuses and in primaries in places like Iowa, New Hampshire, and South Carolina. I think this whole idea of having this conversation that you just mentioned about, having a Kennedy in your administration, to do something like, CDC or HHS was best characterized by Mike Pence, who showed some agility in this campaign that we weren't sure he had, which immediately comes out and says, well, why would I appoint someone like that? I'd appoint a pro-life person to head those agencies. And all of a sudden, DeSantis looks like he forgot he was a Republican. I mean, it was quite extraordinary. So the first thing you got to do is, sit back, don't panic, and say things that are ripped off the headline every day, and actually think about what your message is. You and I talked a while ago about why isn't he talking about the economy, and he's just stuck on all this anti-woke campaign when the economy is what people actually care about. Well, now we find him, I guess, going to finally give a speech after 6 months as a candidate for president. He's going to talk about the economy. So whether he can get there or not, I don't know. But there are some indications that he is off track, and a few that indicate that he might be seeing the light.
Forget the beer or the wine track. Lincoln, that tweet that Rick Davis refers to from Mike Pence, He says, when I'm president, I will only consider pro-life Americans to lead FDA, CDC, or HHS. To be clear, pro-abortion Democrats like RFK Jr. would not even make the list. How does Ron DeSantis keep stepping in it?
Ron DeSantis keeps stepping in it because he's not a very good politician who is unburdened by any charisma or real understanding of the American people, even of the Republican Party nationally.
You too, or something.
If I were advising Ron DeSantis, I should say this clearly. My children would stop speaking to me, my wife would divorce me, and my mother would leave all the money to the dog. But if I were doing that, I would tell him, prepare to run in 2028. Go back and show the world you can be a good governor of Florida. The problem with DeSantis is that he's gotten too far down this kind of MAGA rabbit hole, but Trump owns the contents of that rabbit hole. His campaign has boiled down thus far to, and I'm going to paraphrase what Joe Biden said about Rudy Giuliani about 15 years ago, subject, verb, anti-woke. And if that's the lane you're in, there's simply not enough people there who aren't already committed to Trump. He is also, I'm reminded, I would add a couple things. Most Americans do not want Robert F. Kennedy Jr. running the CDC. Republicans, I mean, Pence is a very good point if you're talking to Republican base, but most Americans would like someone with some medical background running the CDC. Perhaps, different views on masks or abortion rights, but maybe somebody who passed a high school biology class.
You really are a radical.
Exactly, for someone like Bobby Kennedy. However, I believe he has a very good shot of being Trump's vice president because Trump doesn't care about ideology. DeSantis and Pence are, clumsy as DeSantis has been, embedded in the conservative ideology of the Republican Party, and they're trying to navigate that in a MAGA world. Trump has always been very ideologically all over the place, and he's of a generation and a temperament and an outlook where he's still drawn in by the Kennedy name. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see a Trump-Kennedy ticket, but I don't think I think DeSantis reminds me of Al Gore in 1988. Do you remember this campaign?
Yeah.
Everyone thought he was the perfect candidate. Good-looking guy from the South. This was before he had run with Clinton, conservative senator, good military record, and he got in front of the voters, and he just was wooden with no charisma. Now, Gore remained that way throughout the rest of his political career. DeSantis is a little bit like that. He looked really good in November of 2022 when the country hadn't seen him.
Yeah, there's a long list of Jeb Bush, Scott Walker. We've seen this movie before. Rick Davis and Lincoln Mitchell won't take the job. Neither of them. Save the quarter, said Rick. Maybe that'll be in the playbook tomorrow. I'm Joe Mathieu. This is Sound On, only on Bloomberg Radio. As Washington tries to get its arms around, forget crypto, forget AI. How about UFOs? It's next. This is Bloomberg.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Sound On podcast. Catch the program live weekdays at 1 Eastern on Bloomberg Radio, the TuneIn app, Bloomberg.com, and the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Close encounters of the D.C. kind. Picture 3 former military officers at the table. They're in the hearing room. They're testifying before the House Oversight Subcommittee on encounters with unexplained flying objects, UFOs. Ryan Graves, a former Navy fighter pilot, said he witnessed flying objects demonstrating complex maneuvers, couldn't explain. Retired Navy Commander David Fravor described an encounter with a tic-tac-shaped object. Why are they always shaped like tic-tacs now? And former intelligence official David Grush owned the day, describing a secret government program to assess wreckage from, UFOs. Listen to Grush with Congresswoman Nancy Mace.
Do you believe our government has made contact with intelligent extraterrestrials?
Something I can't discuss in public setting.
Okay, I can't ask when you think this occurred. If you believe we have crashed craft, stated earlier, do we have the bodies of the pilots who piloted this craft?
As I've stated publicly already in my News Nation interview, biologics came with some of these recoveries. Yeah.
Biologics.
Were they, I guess, human or non-human biologics?
Kind of biologics.
Non-human, and that was the assessment of people with direct knowledge on the program I talked to that are currently still on the program.
Non-human. Rick Davis, Lincoln Mitchell, I don't know what to do with this, Rick. Is the government really hiding this stuff? When do we find out?
Let us into Area 51. Come on. I mean, like, if I told you I'd have to kill you, answer? Come on.
Right.
I mean, like, you're sitting there, you're telling us there's, crashes that have occurred, that we have biologics. I mean, our imaginations are just going to run rampant all weekend. Can we clear this up? Don't adjourn. Have Congress a special session.
Hold these people over the weekend. Lincoln, I only have 30 seconds. Do you believe the Pentagon could actually hide such information?
I don't think the Pentagon would be able to succeed in keeping something like that from the American public. I don't claim to know what's going on here. It's fascinating. I hope we learn more.
That's the thing. We all want it to be true, don't we? Well, some of us
Absolutely.
do. Thanks for listening to the Sound On podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at 1 p.m. Eastern Time at Bloomberg.com.